From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network, and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Yeah, with the Clinton dynasty coming to a likely end and a new administration in transition, we go inside the President Bill Clinton White House looking back as we move forward. That's today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Russell Riley is Associate Professor and Co-Chair of the Presidential Oral History Program at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where he's conducted nearly 300 oral history interviews with senior officials from every administration from Jimmy Carter onwards. Author and editor of several books on the American presidency, including The Presidency and the Politics of Racial Inequality, Nation-Keeping from 1831 to 1965, and The President's Words, Speeches, and Speechwriting in the Modern White House. The new book is Inside the Clinton White House in Oral History. Welcome, Russell.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate the time.
We're out of time. That was a long intro for you there.
Look, when you've worked on a book for 15 years, you're just happy to get any attention when it's finished. So I appreciate it, and the intro was perfect.
Okay, well, it's our honor. Let me ask you, the timing of this book, was it timed for the election, and kind of was it assuming that there might be a Hillary Clinton, second Clinton presidency?
I'll give you a yes and no answer to that. The no part of it is that we run these projects, these interview projects, on each presidential administration for basically as long as we can get people to agree to participate. And we did about 130 interviews on the Clinton White House. And that took us about 10 to 12 years to complete all of the interviews. And then it takes a couple of years to try to wrap everything up, to get the editing done, to get the necessary legal releases. And so the conduct of the Clinton project had no relationship whatsoever to Mrs. Clinton's political fortunes. Those were going on a separate track. Now, once we completed the project in November of 2014, I have to be honest and say, absolutely, I did look at the political calendar at that point, and recognizing that Mrs. Clinton was probably going to be a viable candidate, I thought it would be a good opportunity to try to get this book out in time for the election, with the theory that the kinds of knowledge that we develop from these interviews ought to be very useful for voters as they go about making decisions about who would make a good presidential candidate or not. So, yes, once the interviews were available, I did work very closely with Oxford University Press to try to press this thing and get it out. It was published just last month in October.
And it's a fascinating book full of a lot of interesting stuff that'll help the Trump administration, too, if they read it.
I would hope so.
One of the great insights to me from this book is the collateral damage from the Lewinsky scandal that you talk about, and how it reduced the potential presidency of what could have been a great reform presidency. Talk a little bit about that.
No, I'm happy to do that. I write in an epilogue to the book that one of the most important lessons I learned from doing these interviews with about 130 people was that the collateral damage from the Lewinsky scandal was probably as profoundly important as the direct damage to Bill Clinton's historical legacy. And let me explain what I mean by that. You don't need me or or a group of interviews to tell you that Bill Clinton was damaged goods as a result of what happened to Monica Lewinsky. As his historical legacy is always going to be clouded by that particular experience, regardless of what good he accomplished in office. But sometimes overlooked is the fact that there were implications for this that also limited Clinton's ability to have a favorable legacy. The first piece of that was that they were teed up in 1997 and 1998 to engage in some major domestic reforms on things like reforming the entitlement system, maybe engage in Social Security reform. Those things were getting teed up at almost the very moment that the news about Monica Lewinsky broke. And so effectively, it denied Clinton and the administration an opportunity over the last 2 or 3 years of his administration to do something that would have been profoundly important as a major legacy item for him. The other piece of the collateral damage was basically Al Gore. And what happened as a result of the Lewinsky scandal is that Gore couldn't figure out how to run for president around that. And there are some of the most fascinating aspects of the interviews is talking with Gore people and Clinton people about how Al Gore psychologically was trying to process all of this and to take his candidacy before the American people with that as a backdrop. Because Al Gore lost, the end of the Clinton administration brought in a new president who was committed to policies very much different from what Bill Clinton was interested in, and on economic policy, on foreign policy, on certain aspects of domestic policy. As Bill Galston said, who was one of his domestic policy advisors, it was as though we had built a castle on the edge of the beach and one wave came in and knocked everything down. And so Bill Clinton's ability to have a favorable legacy in history was interrupted because Al Gore did not succeed him, and President George W. Bush came in with a very different set of priorities, especially on budgets and deficits. And one of Clinton's biggest accomplishments was in balancing the budget, and almost immediately that was lost.
And amazingly enough, 16 years later, we've still not gotten entitlement reform, and we might not have had the destabilization of the Middle East to the degree that we did. So it's pretty profound stuff.
Sure.
Let's jump right to what is the consensus of the most important achievement?
Well, I draw my lessons about the achievements from the people who were there and who have a sort of vested interest. We've spent a lot of time studying this, and almost without exception, they say the biggest thing Clinton did was the 1993 economic package, that he came in to office at a time when the economy was beginning to turn around from the Bush 41 administration, but the deficit numbers that were presented to the incoming administration during the transition period were much worse than anybody had anticipated. Clinton, on the advice of people like Robert Rubin and Alan Blinder, one of his major economic advisors, decided that he had to give up many of the things that he had pledged to do during the course of the campaign in terms of public investments and in terms of spending in order to get the federal budget under control. And it upset a lot of his close advisors who had been with him, who had listened to him on the campaign trail say, we're going to spend more on this, we're going to spend more on that. But Clinton became convinced on the authority of these inside economic advisors that the single best way to influence the U.S. economy was to leverage the budget deficit and therefore to get interest rates under control. And if he could get the interest rates brought down, that would spur on the kind of economic growth that we actually did see in the 1990s. And so I think that's his major accomplishment. Now, in the interviews, people like Alice Rivlin, who was on the Council of Economic Advisors she was with the Office of Management and Budget. Rivlin says, looking in retrospect, it's very hard to figure out exactly what it was that produced the economic boom in the 1990s, but it is certainly true that Bill Clinton made the right decisions in fiscal policy that did have a pronounced effect in pushing together a lot of things, which also included technological innovation and so forth, which resulted in the growth in the 1990s. Importantly, it was not only the economic people who said this, but also a guy like Peter Edelman, who was in the Department of Health and Human Services, resigned his position in protest over welfare reform, but somebody who was generally considered to be a liberal conscience within this administration looked back in his interview and he said, you know something? The best thing Bill Clinton did was that economic package because it set the stage for doing everything else he did to improve the plight of the people that liberals were interested in.
Almost Eisenhower-like, and that last guy to balance the budgets. We get down to the last minute and a half. The conventional wisdom was always that he was very poll-driven, but actually he wasn't.
No, that was one of the surprises of these interviews, was that I came in, like everybody else, thinking this was somebody who had been driven by polls, and yet somebody like Bill Galston, who was a domestic policy advisor, said, look, you don't get to a 1993 budget plan with all the pain associated with it and with the Republicans screaming that it was going to create a depression by following the polls. And you don't get to a bailout of the Mexican peso in 1994 almost the day after he had lost Congress to the Republicans in 1994, his foreign policy advisors came in and said, Mexico's about to go on the toilet. You're going to have to risk your presidency to get that problem solved, and he did it. So I think on those issues and on other foreign policy issues, there was a sense that this was a president that was very poll-driven, but the people who watched him on a daily basis understood there were places where he clearly departed from what the pollsters would have told him because he believed the good of the country depended on it.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Business Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. And coming next, we'll look back at Clinton's early political career. And we're back with presidential oral historian Russell Riley, UVA's Miller Center. And as we look back, one of the things that also strikes in the book throughout is the personal characteristics, the mix of brilliance, policy, politics. Talk about the personal side of Bill Clinton.
Oh, that's I think is my favorite part of the interviews, because the thing that you clearly cannot get from the outside and relying on press accounts is what a person is like to work with on a day-to-day basis. What you hear routinely from the people who work closely with him was just the remarkable brilliance and high energy level of this president. I asked one of his advisors if there was a problem area that in foreign policy that was too complicated for the president to deal with, and he said, "Are you kidding? Too complicated? This is a guy that had a genius for policy as well as a genius for politics." And I think we've had presidents who maybe were one or the other, but almost nobody who had a combination of those two factors. So one of the things that you find from these interviews is, given the fact that we've already mentioned Lewinsky, that obviously it was an enormous amount of personal anxiety and disappointment among people who worked closely with this president, that he gave in to those temptations and that it had an adverse effect on his legacy and consequently their legacies. But almost to a person, they were floored at how brilliant this man was and how competent he was in dealing with policy issues.
And to throw it in, his appetite was unbelievable, too.
Well, his appetite for many things.
Yes,
I think that the flip side of that, of course, is that there was sometimes a kind of lack of discipline in this White House. That the policy people said, it's a policy nerd's dream to come into the Oval Office and have a president who is genuinely interested in what you're talking about and wants to engage with you. And so what tended to happen was these discussions would go on and on and on until somebody, and often it was the First Lady, would have to speak up and say if she was in a meeting. She was known to be much more disciplined. She would come in and say, "Bill, we have to cut the discussions now. You got to make a decision one way or the other. We've got to get this settled and move on." So there was that appetite, but there was also the physical appetites, which it gets mentioned on several occasions. He wasn't eating at McDonald's the way he was during the course of the 1992 campaign, but I can remember Bruce Reed, who was his domestic policy advisor, saying that they had come to a meeting at one point and they were in the governor's mansion and they'd come for breakfast, and somebody had brought in from the kitchen ham biscuits for about 6 people. And he said Clinton, in an amazing display, ate every one of those, that nobody else got anything. He just sort of inhaled them all. So I think he actually exercised so he could eat.
Let's move to sort of try and understand his behavior, why he found it tough to make decisions, etc. Very dysfunctional family, the alcoholism. Is there a link in there?
Well, the people who knew him best said that there was. And again, I go back to Bill Galston, who is at the Brookings Institution and very, very smart guy, who's been around Washington for a long time. And he made the observation during the course of the interviews that many people who are born without father figures will seek out people who have greater authority around them sort of as a substitute. He said it was curious about Bill Clinton that he never did that it was notable that he seemed to feel comfortable indulging in his appetites in a way that otherwise would not have been the case by normal circumstances. So, it's hard to say. There is in the book a fair amount of sort of amateur armchair psychoanalyzing by people who are close to him, but those are fascinating observations to get because they are so well informed, and these are by people who were generally favorable towards the president, but understood that, particularly when it came to something like discipline, he just he had a hard time saying no. And particularly with the clock. I mean, famously, Clinton time ran well behind any other time. And somebody told me outside the confines of the interview, I believe it was Bruce Reed also, he said Bill Clinton's body clock is set on Hawaii time, that everything started that much later and went deep into the night.
Being the youngest governor and then the youngest ex-governor of a small state, how formative was that defeat on him?
Oh, it was very much so. Some of the most fascinating interviews we do, by the way, are with the personal aides. These are the people that don't have any policy portfolios, and they don't have any policy aspirations. Their job's just there to sort of be the personal valet to the president. And I remember one of these personal aides telling us that he was on Air Force One at one point, late into the night, talking with the president about something, and he happened to refer back to that election. And he said the president started recounting the election returns from each of the counties across the state and indicating why the election results had come out as they had. He said it was just fascinating how fixated he was on this, and it was clear that in retrospect that had a bracing impact on him, and that the former governor, to return to office, learned some very, very important things that he needed to do in order to get elected. Somebody else told us a story that Clinton loved to tell on himself in this regard, which was that he was out campaigning to go back into the office, and he ran into this old fella in Arkansas, and the guy said, "Yeah, I know who you are. I voted against you last time, and I'm going to vote for you this time." And Clinton said, "Do you mind telling me why?" And the guy said, "Well, I voted against you because you increased the tax on the hunting license." He said, "Well, I understand that, but why are you going to vote for me this time?" And he said, "Because I think you're not stupid enough to do it again." So Clinton learned that there were certain things that he could and he couldn't do, and I think it had a sort of conservative impact on his ability to govern.
There's this sort of recurring pattern that after great successes, he lets his guard down and has these mistakes. He gave that famous speech of the DLC in Cleveland, and then the Paula Jones incident was right after. This goes on and on. What did folks say about that? And also, what did they say about the relationship between him and Hillary?
Yeah, well, Mickey Cantor, who had been the chair of the campaign and was Commerce Secretary and had been involved with him for a long time, made exactly that point. He said, it's a pattern with Bill Clinton that when things seem to be going really well, there's going to be something to go bad. And, some of that, I think, was their fault. Some of it was the fault of there being a very organized opposition that originated in Arkansas that stayed with him and frankly, was involved with Mrs. Clinton in this most recent election. So there was never an opportunity for them to get a substantial amount of breathing space against this kind of opposition. And Jim, there was a follow-up part to that question.
Their relationship.
It was a close marriage in a way that probably is incomprehensible to people from the outside. You would expect from these two professionals, where there was this famous problem created by the president stepping out on his marriage, that it couldn't possibly be close. And yet, by every account, these are people who loved each other dearly and still do, and have managed to make things work in a way that is literally, from the outside, incomprehensible.
Fascinating stuff. Listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll be back now. We'll look into more depth on Bill Clinton's presidency. We're back with Russell Riley. New book just out, Inside the Clinton White House, an Oral History. And we'll look at the presidency now in a bit more detail. First off, because the timing is perfect with people looking at President-elect Trump's transition. The transition wasn't really that well run, was it, for Bill Clinton?
Oh, it was terrible, and historically terrible. And you get this not just from the people who were inside the Clinton administration, but people who from the outside looking in on it. But it was fascinating. As I was driving into the office today, I was listening to people on a very prominent talk radio program talk about what they think is going on inside the Trump administration. And I kept thinking to myself, how do they know what's going on inside these discussions with Trump. I wouldn't have presumed to know anything until I had these very serious and confidential and candid conversations with people well after the event, and came to learn that although we had expectations of what was going on, we really didn't have a very good idea about what was happening inside Clinton's transition. But there were severe problems, and in some respects, Donald Trump is replicating the problems of Clinton's term. And I'll give you a very good illustration of this. I had mentioned earlier Mickey Cantor is somebody who'd been involved for a long time with the president. There was some trouble on the campaign at one point that involved Cantor, and I was told by a man named Eli Siegel, who was the developer of AmeriCorps, and I think was also very senior in the campaign, that he and the president had decided that the way to deal with Mickey Cantor and the tension he was creating with the campaign was to get him off the campaign trail and into a preliminary effort to deal with the transition issues. In other words, sort of sideline him into the transition. And that was, as Siegel said, that's an elegant solution. But it had a problem later, because when they won and it came time to think seriously about the transition, they discovered that what Cantor had produced was not something that was making the people who had stayed in the main line of the campaign happy, and so they deep-sixed Cantor and all of his planning and basically had to start over. So you've got this terrible friction then within the Clinton networks between people who were following Cantor and people who didn't, and you're having to start over from scratch in the single most complicated kind of transition you can imagine, which is building a United States government to be run out of the White House from scratch.
So you're saying that the dumping of Christie by Trump is the same pattern.
I'm telling you that it shows you the value of knowing your history, because I can't imagine that they would have done exactly the same thing. That Chris Christie had been, by all accounts, and we may find out that this isn't true when it comes to doing oral histories with these folks much later, but by all accounts, Chris Christie was put into that position to get him out of the campaign. Then what did we learn? What he had accomplished there was viewed as subpar, or they didn't want him to have control of this, and so they moved somebody else in. So I think they basically replicated the same problem. The second thing that they did in the transition was they focused all of their attention on the cabinet.
Yeah,
they put together a cabinet that looked like America. It was, by all accounts, a terrific cabinet. But by the same token, they didn't spend very much attention dealing with the White House staff. Now, to Trump's credit, he has focused on the White House staff and has invited, as we know, two of his major aides in already, Priebus and Bannon, to take two senior positions in his White House. So he evidently did learn that lesson. But in the Clintons' case, one of the fascinating things we found out through the course of the oral history interviews was that Bill Clinton's intention was to fill his White House staff first as well. He went to his longtime friend Mac McLarty, who later did accept the job. He immediately said, "Mac, I'd like for you to be my chief of staff." McLarty said, "I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not sure that's the best position for me. Can I get back to you?" And Clinton said yes. Now, what he might have done was to bear down and get an answer at that point, but the fact that he didn't do that meant that for several weeks the construction of the White House staff was put on the back burner, and when he came back to it, he was really behind the eight ball. And there are these inside accounts of people who showed up for sort of a class picture in a day or two before they were to start working in the White House, and people were looking around saying, "I don't know who any of these people are." It was literally a government of strangers. And we hope that the Trump people will have learned enough to know that you've got to designate these White House staffers in advance so that they get to know one another before they come in and are actually responsible for running the government.
Interesting. Now, we talked about the 1993 economic package as the biggest accomplishment. They went in and he sort of repeated a little bit of his first year as governor of Arkansas, right? He overloaded the circuits, the stimulus, the economic package, welfare, reinventing government, all of that stuff, and it really screwed up his credibility.
And health care on top of that.
Yes.
So you're exactly right. Now, there were some people we interviewed who said, our theory was to flood the circuits, that we knew Congress was going to slow walk stuff, and that you've only got a certain amount of time a president's first year is very important, and you need to take advantage of the support that you have during the first year. And so there is some evidence that they actually intentionally overloaded the circus because they believed that that was the only way that they could get Congress to act. There were a lot of other people, though, who reported in the interviews that was a colossal mistake to try to do too much at one time, or alternatively, that the sequencing was off. And the one place where you most prominently see that is among groups of people who believe that they would have been well served to have started with welfare reform rather than with health care reform. If they had done that, Clinton had clearly campaigned on welfare reform more than he had on health care reform. Yeah. And if he had pursued welfare reform first, he would have communicated to the Washington community, to the American people, that he very much was a different kind of Democrat. By coming in and proceeding with tax increases, with some crime and gun control measures, and with health care reform, which gave the appearance of a big government takeover of the health care industry, the message communicated to the American people was this is a sort of FDR kind of New Deal, Great Society Democrat, and it was those kind of impulses that led to a major Republican revolution in 1994.
Tell us now why the strengths and weaknesses of Hillary, the health care ultimately failed.
What we hear from people who were very closely involved in that was that Mrs. Clinton at the time had a firm belief in the possibilities of applying intellect and good intentions to public problems, and that if you had enough well-intentioned people, very bright, committed to solving a problem, that you could that there was no limits to what you could accomplish. And so she put together a very complex healthcare task force that ended up creating a reform measure that was over 1,300 pages long, that was very detailed, that by one account was very much like a Swiss watch, that once you built the Swiss watch, you couldn't very well have somebody come in and start tinkering with parts of it, but because it would throw all the mechanisms off. And so there was a very real sense that once the reform was developed, that there was no room for any major input from anybody on the outside to try to come in and to make amendments to it. And so the image of Mrs. Clinton from this experience was of somebody who was overly rational, not concerned about politics, and was unwilling to listen to critiques from the outside. And frankly, I think some of that was valid. I also think she learned, and in a piece that I wrote for the Atlantic website several weeks before the election, I said, look, every president comes in with the potential for colossal problems. One of the great advantages of Hillary Clinton as a presidential candidate is that she's already been there. I mean, she's already had her Bay of Pigs, to use the example that historians often refer back to first-year problems for an administration. She learned her lessons the hard way very early on, and that actually would be one of the great advantages to having her return to the White House. I wasn't making a case. We're completely nonpartisan at the Miller Center. I wasn't making an argument for Mrs. Clinton from a partisan perspective, only trying to apply a historian's lens to this experience and help people understand that if health care was something that you were trying to weigh in your assessment of Mrs. Clinton, that may actually, in the long term, come out to weigh on the plus side of Mrs. Clinton than on the negative side.
Now, we're getting down to the last minute, so this is kind of unfair, but how would you summarize the major foreign policy achievements? What were they?
Well, I think the biggest thing was the creation of a post-Cold War way of looking at the world, and it was not easily come by. It was complicated. They had a number of problem areas that they had to deal with. But Tony Lake, who was the president's national security advisor, says, damn it, when we came in, we inherited all kinds of fires going on, places like Haiti, places like Bosnia, places like Somalia. And I'll tell you, when we left office, those kinds of crisis areas were not the kinds of problems that they were when we inherited them. So although they may not have been very elegant in designing a post-Cold War role for the United States of America, Lake felt like they had done a very good job of crisis management, which is one of the president's first responsibilities.
Our last national segment coming up, Bill Clinton's legacy. We're back for our final national segment. Russell Riley of the Presidential Oral History Program at UVA. Quickly on foreign policy, he pushed NAFTA, which was not a traditional Democratic thing, and now it's come full circle, hasn't it?
It sure has. And, it's an interesting thing about presidential legacies that for many people, NAFTA was one of the major accomplishments of the administration. I think when we interviewed Leon Panetta, who was the chief of staff, he mentioned NAFTA, as did many others. But the Democratic Party has changed. It wasn't a priority of the Democrats even at that time. I mean, Clinton largely embraced it because of his commitment to free trade, but he also understood that it was a way of distinguishing himself as a different kind of Democrat. I think in retrospect, that was something that does not sit well among Democratic constituencies. So in considering a Bill Clinton legacy, the fact that he embraced NAFTA is not something that rates very highly among people who may have been supportive of Clinton when he was president.
I look at legacy stuff now. On one hand, is this sort of where the politics of personal destruction really began? And secondly, what about this bridge to the 21st century?
The politics of personal destruction angle is an important one to understand, in part, again, because there was a concerted effort throughout the course of Clinton's presidency to deny him legitimacy and to deny him a favorable presidential legacy. The enormous aggravation of people within the Clinton networks is that they felt at the time that the Lewinsky scandal popped up that they had been pretty successful in beating back that kind of opposition and were mounting some major successes, including a balanced budget for the first time in a generation. So the politics of personal destruction angle is indeed important for understanding Clinton because it focuses on the opposition. The bridge to the 21st century was a metaphor developed during the course of the 1996 campaign, because Bob Dole, in I believe his convention acceptance address, had made a lot of claims about the America that he knew growing up, and he wanted to basically be a bridge back to that kind of idealized 1950s era sepia-toned past. And the Clintons immediately saw that Dole had left himself vulnerable, that elections were about the future. And the most important thing, obviously, about Clinton's presidency is that he was a two-termer. That's the basic standard for deciding whether a president is important or not, is whether they clear that threshold to a second term.
And first Democrat since FDR.
That's correct.
Let's look a little bit on the accomplishments of a lasting nature, and I'll throw out three: AmeriCorps, the Earned Income Tax, and environmental president. Would you see those? Would you see others of a lasting?
This question about presidential legacies and economics is fascinating to me, and we deal with this some in the book. It's kind of striking to me that when we think about presidents in the long scope of history, we tend to ignore the extent to which they were successful in the economics of the moment. In other words, how are the average lives of people who were living at the time affected by this president? If the economy is robust and good, people are living well. They are they're going about their daily affairs in ways that they have a very positive effect for the national government. And yet, when we start thinking about legacies, we practically ignore that question about the well-being in the 4 to 8 years, and we start thinking, well, what are the long-term consequences of things that the presidents have done? AmeriCorps, there's still a little bit of something there in residue, but it's not easy outside the realm of economics to find things that constitute a major lasting impact in the way that say Social Security reform would have been true. Earned income tax credit, I take that. I think that was probably the most important welfare program of the Clinton administration, and I think the people who were inside the administration would freely acknowledge that the residue there is an important factor in Bill Clinton's legacy.
All right, let's look at some of the biggest disappointments and see what you think of these. Middle East peace not quite getting there, the Rwanda mass genocide, those pardons the last night, of the last night of his presidency? Where do you come down on the biggest?
I think all of those are important. Rwanda is a very difficult case because that also this is a case where I really do hope your listeners will look at the book, because people agonized over Rwanda, and yet when they started talking about the specifics, they said there just wasn't anything that we could do. And in the most literal sort of Greek sense, this was tragic, that they knew that something awful was unfolding. At the extremes, there were things that they could have done. I mean, Tony Lake says, look, we have the 82nd Airborne. It could have been done. And yet the politics of the moment coming after Somalia, after Black Hawk Down, it just was not in the cards that the United States government was going to send troops over, and Congress tolerated it. Congress would not have tolerated it. The American people would not have tolerated it, and yet Rwanda was what it was, which was a catastrophe.
Okay, we're down to the last minute and a half. First part is the conventional wisdom was he didn't do any anti-terrorism. That's not really true, as you see in the book. The second piece is, does his legacy end up being ephemeral or not?
Well, I think on counterterrorism, he certainly did do a lot. And Sandy Berger goes on at length in his interview about all of the things that they did. A lot of speech making, and there were a lot of things that were going on behind the scenes. Wonderful tales told by the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Hugh Shelton, about his being called from Central Virginia to come hustling up the I-95 to go to the Pentagon to try to deal with reports that Osama bin Laden was where they could put a Tomahawk missile on him. So there were efforts made at that time. But the and Jim, I'm sorry.
The ephemeral or lasting?
No, I think there are lasting impacts, but they're much more modest than they would have hoped. That the effect of Lewinsky in particular, both direct and indirect, simply made it impossible for them to do with a second term what a two-term president would like to do.
Thanks to Russell Riley. Fascinating stuff. The book, again, Inside the Clinton White House and Oral History. It's published by Oxford University Press. Our next show, we've got a foreign policy expert, State Department experience on what the new president should do in the Middle East quagmire. Russell's agreed to stay with us for an overtime segment for our non-commercial outlets and for our YouTube version. Thanks to Russell Riley of the Middle Center Presidential Program at UVA. Thanks to our national audience. We'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. This is segment 5, more inside the Clinton White House with Russell Riley. I tell you, it kind of saddens me that he sabotaged his own chance for a great legacy, really, is what it comes down to. It sounds like.
Well, I think, to go back to the point that I was making when we were on, that it really is striking how little historians pay attention to prosperity. And it strikes me as a bit odd, because you would think that one of the ways of judging how good a president is how do people feel about their daily lives as it's affected by a president at the point at which he's serving. Doesn't that merit some consideration in terms of how you judge somebody?
That is something that has been a huge thing in my mind, is that it takes a lot of maturity to do what he did. For instance, think about this. He came out and he put his everything on the line to get this balanced budget. That's not a sexy thing. That's like Eisenhower. Obama is going to get the legacy for health care no matter what happens, right?
Yeah.
And think about it. He could have come in and said, I'm going to do a Nixon in China and do entitlement reform because I'm a liberal Democrat, and when I get that done, we'll do the other stuff. But he would never have gotten sex credit for that, if you will.
Yeah, no,
it's a fascinating thing. It's a good way to start. We're going to examine a lot of people stuff, personalities in this segment because we have a little bit more time to go through that. And a fascinating insight in the book to me was Hillary Clinton's image is so much harder, tougher than Bill's, and a lot of people, she doesn't seem to be likable. That was the famous finding in this campaign. Right. But in this book, it says that she has much more fierce loyalty amongst her people in Hillary land than Bill has in his world.
That's true, and that actually surprised me as well.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the remarks that was made by Roger Altman, who was a Deputy Treasury Secretary and somebody with long Washington experience, when we were talking about the differences between Bill and Hillary, said Hillary inspires much greater loyalty than Bill does. That if you look at the people surrounding Bill Clinton, there were folks like, and George Stephanopoulos' name often popped up because he was somebody who was perceived as being a bit disloyal by being in the inner circle and then going out and trading on his White House experience to make a name for himself in the media. Now, they may have been a little oversensitive to that, but that was what the image was. And there was this general sense that people were not afraid of Bill Clinton. They didn't love Bill Clinton in that way that some people, have affection for their bosses. And so they weren't terribly loyal to him. And yet Altman said it was really noticeable that Hillary Clinton engendered a tremendous amount of loyalty. And I asked him to explain it, and he said, I think it's because she doesn't see everything through the lens of politics in the way that Bill Clinton was. That she sort of wears her heart on her sleeve a little bit. That there is, a greater sense of social affection that comes through that wasn't natural in Bill's network, where the political tended to overweigh everything else. And so, I found that to be really striking, and I paid attention to it during the campaign because one always wonders when loyalty is a main virtue, what the downsides of that are. I mean, I think we saw some of that during the Nixon administration, where people would overvalue loyalty at the expense of everything else. It's hard for me to know this close to the 2016 election whether whether some of the trouble that we saw in her campaign could have been a function of people overvaluing loyalty or not. But it's
Trump seems to put a huge premium on that too.
He does. The question is whether it comes back to him, and
Right.
that's the hard thing to know. I mean, there are not there are not staff people around him now who have long experience with him. He has a family, and that it has been sort of a substitute for staff. And there were multiple staff shakeups during the course of the 2016 campaign on Trump's side. And what's going to be really interesting is, this question about how loyalty is perceived within the networks. The thing that I noticed mostly about Trump is that by designating two sort of co-equal figures, Priebus and Bannon, in his earliest appointments, that violates all the known rules about how White Houses work. The only time where sort of multiple chiefs of staff or multiple centers of power ever worked was under Reagan, and it didn't work very long, and B, it only worked for a brief period of time because of the extraordinary personalities who were there, who had experience with them and clear realms of authority, and C, on the evidence of scores of interviews that I've done with Republicans and Democrats alike, it is not replicable. You cannot replicate what Ronald Reagan had with that group. And so I think that this is a problem area. If you set up two separate centers of power within your White House, the loyalty issue is going to be a real problem.
Let me ask this question on, and I don't know how the methodology works, but you do not have oral history with Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, people like Dick Morris, who had a big role. Is there any reason for that?
There were attempts made to interview all three of them that have not succeeded as of yet. There is still a possibility their interviews could be recorded. We work very closely, and in full disclosure, we work very closely with the foundation, the Clinton Foundation, the Library Foundation, and that's the normal course of operations for the Miller Center. We've been doing this. We work very closely with the George H.W. Bush Foundation and with the George W. Bush Foundation and with the Edward Kennedy Foundation. That's the source of funding for the interviews. These are very expensive propositions, and so we have had, a very close operating relationship with people very close to these presidents. But there are folks who who, for one reason or another, simply prefer not to be interviewed. And they're extended invitations, and we like to be as comprehensive as we can. But in some instances, particularly when you've got very busy public officials, they're reluctant to take the time. Our interviews normally last over 2 days, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 hours of conversations. And I think particularly with Mrs. Clinton's political aspirations still active over the last, as far back as we can recall, that I think it's created some additional vulnerabilities. I often say that dynasties are bad for business in oral history. We encountered this with the Bushes when we were interviewing people related to President Bush 41, the father. It was not at all uncommon for people who had experience with the son to feel uncomfortable, and the same was true when we got to the son, that there were people who were uncomfortable because of not wanting to say things that would
hurt Jeb.
Reflect that would hurt Jeb, or that would reflect poorly on the father. So I think that we are, at long last, knock on wood, maybe beyond the dynasty business, or beyond the reach of the dynasties, and that'll make the oral history work a lot simpler.
Well, something tells me they'll have more time on their hands.
They should, and then the anxieties about how it might reflect on them are diminished. I mean, this was a real issue with this book. One of my bad moments as this book was coming out was the fact that the Daily Mail in London got a hold of a pre-publication copy of this, and with these blaring headlines indicated that the book would end Hillary Clinton's chances of being elected president. Now, this was appearing on their website in between pictures of Kardashians in various states of undress, so it's kind of hard to know how serious to take it.
I saw that in the book. I didn't quite grasp what was going on there. What did they have anything?
Well, there are some earthy characterizations of the scandals. There is almost nothing new in this book about the behavior at the root of the scandals. For example, the Monica Lewinsky business.
Right.
Why? Well, because Kenneth Starr spent 6 years and $50 million with subpoena power and an army of IRS agents and FBI agents digging into this. He found and then published anything you could possibly know about Monica Lewinsky and that scandal. So it's highly unlikely that a group of scholars sitting in a room 5 years later would stumble onto something that had not already been dealt with in that interview. But what the Daily Mail was picking up was, virtually every time somebody used a word that you wouldn't want to repeat in front of your mother. And there was, there were a couple of instances where people had used fairly earthy language in saying, in one instance to Bill Clinton during the course of the 1992 campaign, look, if I ever catch you fella doing anything like this again, I'm gonna, and I'm not gonna repeat it on over the air. It's a great way to sell books. If you want to know what the what the language is, come to the book. But the Daily Mail had picked that up and run with it. So I thought that was a pretty good indication. We've got people who are supportive of Clinton who've looked at this book and find it very useful, and people on the opposite side have come to the same conclusion.
I think that you have to say that you get a sense that this guy is a unique talent. He's brilliant, what he could put together. So you do get that sense out of it.
It is. It's really remarkable. Again, there are stories told here about his multitasking ability, for example. I mean, it's not at all uncommon for somebody to come in for a briefing and to find Bill Clinton reading the New York Times, or working a New York Times crossword puzzle, having a deck of cards opened up playing solitaire, maybe having a book opened at the same time that he's reading, and going back and forth to these three things, and by all appearances paying absolutely no attention. And for the briefer to discover at the end of the briefing that the president had heard perfectly everything that had been said, and even caught the nuances that some others who were involved in developing the briefing had not picked up on. So he really, he's a remarkable political figure with all of the foibles that we know about, but also just an amazing mental capacity, as well as an extraordinary political capacity. I mean, John Sununu, who was a Republican chief of staff for George H.W. Bush, said in an interview that we did for that project, he said, I would never elect Bill Clinton president of the United States because I don't think I could trust him. But he said, I would certainly make him my White House chief of staff if he were available, because he is so smart, both politically and in terms of policy. One of my favorite chapters in the book is commentary that I drew from interviews that we did for the George H.W. Bush project about this person that managed to beat their boss in the 1992 elections. Really fascinating characterizations of this person.
I often wonder if if Clinton might have benefited from being president a little older, when maybe he was a little bit more mature, controlled his appetites. It's kind of an interesting thought.
That I've never thought about it, but maybe if some of those appetites had faded, as they tend to do with time, that some of those vulnerabilities might not have been so prominent. But look, one of the remarkable things about Clinton was he decided to run in 1992. None of the first tier of Democrats wanted to run against George H.W. Bush in 1992 because he had just won the first Gulf War, and in 1991, at the beginning of the year, had an approval rating in excess of 90%. Who runs in that environment? Bill Clinton decides to do it because he believes that Bush can't stay at those high levels. He believes that with the Cold War at end, that the American people are going to turn their sights inward and that they will seek out somebody unlike George H.W. Bush, who will focus like a laser beam on the economy and who will be focused on change and in bringing about in ways that Bush could not. So I think you're right about the maturity level. It's really a fascinating question about history, but I think we also have to give Clinton credit for his wisdom and his audacity in 1992 in seeing an avenue into the White House that nobody else senior in the Democratic Party thought was there.
Good point. Now let's do some personalities now.
Okay.
Al Gore, the relationship soured. He sounded pedantic. He had hyperbole. He called Clinton the best president in history after the impeachment. He said he invented the Internet. What is Al Gore all about? How do you put a box around that?
We had fascinating conversations. Some of the most interesting conversations we had in this project were with senior Gore aides, because they came at the Clinton presidency from a slightly different angle, and of course the end of the presidency they experienced in a much more painful way than President Clinton did himself. But they just had some fascinating insights about Gore. One of the things that we learned was that the very fact of Gore serving as vice president had a deleterious effect on his political skills. And I remember this interview. I did it in New York with one of his aides, and I said, I've heard of people acting presidential, but I don't think I've ever heard of anybody acting vice presidential. And you're telling me that Gore had succeeded as vice president because he had absorbed how to be vice president within his bones. And the very fact of that vice presidentialness made it exceedingly difficult for Al Gore to step back up to the podium as his own man as the number one character in the Democratic political universe in 2000, because he was out of practice and because the American people were used to seeing Gore as vice president. It is no accident that since Martin Van Buren, George H.W. Bush is the only president to have been elected to the presidency out of the vice presidential position, and that reality caught up with Al Gore. The second thing that happened was that during the course of the campaign, Gore made up his mind that it wasn't enough for him to be elected president, but he had to be elected president on his own rights, that he did not want to be elected president as the continuation of Bill Clinton's presidency. And a lot of people think that that was a mistake, that the simplest thing for Gore to have done would have been to have said, everything you dislike about Bill Clinton is because of a personal mistake he made. There's no way you can mistake Bill Clinton's personal behavior for Al Gore's personal behavior. So set that aside. That's not a part of Al Gore. Everything you like about Bill Clinton, which is policy related. I was sitting in the Oval Office when those decisions were made. I was influential in getting to yes on those decisions, and therefore it's important for you to elect Al Gore as a continuation of the success of Bill Clinton. He would not do that because he had a psychological block against being seen as a continuation of Clinton. And this is another place where, sort of armchair psychoanalysis happens during these interviews to explain why it is that this person couldn't see past that. He wasn't willing to accept the presidency on any grounds. It had to be on his own terms.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, let's talk about the chiefs of staffs. You've got Mac McLarty, who's been on this show, who's a real gentleman, Leon Panetta, and Erskine Bowles.
Well, the first was Mac McLarty. McLarty was a consummate gentleman. He was there to help try to get the trains to run on time, but as Bruce Reed said, in the Clinton universe, the trains never ran on time, and there was a sense that he wasn't political enough to do the job well and wasn't tough enough. He's succeeded by Leon Panetta. Panetta comes in, and one of the first things he does is he says, Mr. President, you're going to stop jogging on the mall in those short shorts. It's not presidential. It doesn't look presidential. He said the president agreed with that. Panetta was tougher, cut down on these bull session meetings, and was exercising discipline in a way that nobody else did. Behind him, I believe, was John Podesta. And Podesta was sort of a continuation of McLarty. And then there was Erskine Bowles, exactly, who I think was also a longtime acquaintance of the president's, who also was somebody who was known to be, sort of very good, was non-political, but was serving at the time of the Lewinsky scandal, and I think was somebody who felt like he was being served spinach for breakfast every morning because of it. That required a political person in the way that Podesta was. There was I don't remember exactly what the sequencing was there, but each of them brought different strengths to that role.
Basically, it comes down to that the chief of staff has to fit around the personality of the president, right? Because none of them really were able to rein in the whole sort of undisciplined way that he went about his decision making.
Not entirely. I think that it's true, particularly in terms of his scheduling, that they just learned over time that you could do the best that you could, but that they were always going to be running behind times with him. But going back to the discussion about Al Gore, one of Gore's people became a deputy White House chief of staff, and for me, one of the most fascinating exchanges in the interviews was talking with this person about what the role of a White House staff member is. As historians and political scientists from the outside, we always want to hold the president responsible for what goes on in his operation. There's a logic to that, and we always want to say that the axiom is every president gets the White House staff he deserves. And yet Roy Neal, who was a longtime chief of staff for Al Gore and who came in and became deputy chief of staff, he said, I think that lets the staff off too easy. He said, when you take a job like this, by golly, there are scores of people who would love to have this job, who work very hard for this job. You worked very hard for it. You got it. You owe the President of the United States the best that you can possibly do, and if that means offending him or bringing him news that he doesn't want to hear, it is your responsibility to do that. And if he's not performing at his maximum capacity as president because of indiscipline in meetings or indiscipline with schedule, it is your responsibility as a staff person to figure out a way to get it done. He said people want these jobs. It is the highest staff job you can have in the world. And if you're doing the president's work as it should be done, don't accept that it's the president's responsibility. It is your responsibility as a member of the staff to make sure that the trains run on time and to create an environment where your president can succeed. It's not the president's job to conform his work to you. It's the reverse.
Interesting. Let's look at some foreign policy leaders now. Start with Russian President Boris Yeltsin.
They had an interesting relationship in that I think they had a kind of mutual admiration society. Nancy Soderberg, who was a deputy national security advisor, said that Clinton believed that Yeltsin was a sort of gutsy decision maker, and he admired that. And Yeltsin felt the same with him. Their personal relationship was sometimes checkered. Yeltsin liked to drink a lot, and so there were occasions when not very much got done at summit meetings because Yeltsin had found his way to the liquor cabinet, and it was just a reality of life that they had to live with.
What about Tony Blair?
Blair is a fascinating character. We did an interview with him on Clinton, and there are some interviews that haven't been cleared yet. That particular interview didn't make it in the book because we don't have his approval to release it. I hope it'll come out. It was not a long interview, but Blair was another one of these third-way politicians, somebody who had left the conventions of Labour Party politics in the UK, and so followed Clinton very closely. Clinton's pollster, Stanley Greenberg, was also Tony Blair's pollster, and we asked him about differences between the two, and he said, and this goes back to a comment that I made about Hillary earlier. He said Clinton was very good at conciliation. Clinton always wanted to conciliate. He was let's come reason together. He said Blair would kneecap you. Blair was tough,
interesting,
and was constantly looking for ways to get on top of his Tory Conservative Party opposition and to beat him up. And he said that in Clinton's case, if he threw a punch at somebody, he felt guilty about it and wanted to apologize, as he did with Jesse Jackson in the 1992 campaign. He said that was not Tony Blair's way. Blair's way was, you kick them when they're down, and you kick them hard, and you keep them down, and you keep kicking them until they're lifeless. And that was a real eye-opening description.
Do you think that he felt very let down by Arafat's inability to sign on the dotted line?
You're talking about Bill Clinton? Oh,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that was, I'm sure of it, was his, apart from the personal scandals, that would have been the single most, the biggest disappointment of his career. He spent a lot of time in the last couple of years trying to broker a final agreement on Middle East peace. They felt that they had it teed up several times. Look, Clinton was very much an honest broker. He wasn't above pushing the Israelis and the Palestinians, but people like Dennis Ross, whom we did interview in the book, said ultimately with Arafat, he never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. That there was an occasion at the end where an agreement was in reach, and Arafat simply would not take the final steps to do this. And that had implications, mind you, not just for the Middle East. It also had implications for Korea, because I interviewed former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung in Seoul, and he said Clinton had promised me that he was going to come to Korea near the end of his presidency, and we together were going to figure out a way to get the North normalized, to create this, finally to reach a lasting peace with North Korea. He said Clinton made that pledge to me and was firmly committed to doing it, but at the very last minute had to pull out because he said there are developments in the Middle East that I feel like I've got a chance to create progress there, and I need to tend to it. And so by sticking around and hoping that Arafat would follow through, he lost his opportunity on Korea.
Wow. Talking about South Korea, Jimmy Carter got involved there and in Haiti. Talk about how Clinton managed that, or was he frustrated by Carter?
Oh gosh, yeah, they were. That's an interesting relationship. And by the way, Carter, we also interviewed for the project, and that's another one like Blair's that we haven't had released yet. So there may be a volume 2 or a second edition of Inside the Clinton White House when we get the rest of the interviews out. It was a frustration. I think they were happy to have President Carter involved, because he went to Haiti and was, I think, instrumental in helping to sort of dissipate a potential military conflict there. Although the people who were close to it said that the Haitians didn't cave in until the planes were in the air with the paratroopers on television, and they knew that the threat was real and they had to cave in. But Carter had been down there, and he did, similar duty in Korea at a very delicate moment when William Perry, who was Defense Secretary, said it's as close as we have come to war in a very long time in the United States. This would have been other than sort of post 9/11 things, but it was. A war on the Korean Peninsula would be a very different kind of enterprise than what we've seen in the Middle East. And Carter was there, but it was always a source of frustration because he had his own independent views on things and was not very susceptible to hands-on direction by the White House, and that was a source of frustration. They appreciated the fact that he was available, but he tended to do a bit more freelancing than the White House wished to have him do.
Last question. You've obviously been involved in several of these presidential oral histories. Do you end up with sort of in your own mind comparisons between the various presidents, or how do you look at them across the whole spectrum?
No, I absolutely. I haven't done any formal comparisons across, and that's an interesting. There may be a book in there at some point doing this, but I've been involved, as you indicated at the outset, with these interviews on every president since Jimmy Carter, both Democrats and Republicans. And I think one of the things that you come to appreciate is that things are a lot more complicated on the inside than they look from the outside. And another thing, and I sometimes teach undergraduates at the University of Virginia, and I can honestly tell them, I said, look, you need to understand that you can really be proud of the people who are serving you in your government. That this is sort of some Pollyanna-ish flag-waving patriotism that I would present. It is rather hard-earned conclusion reached after spending hundreds of hours, closeted with these people, listening to them, that it's remarkable how bright the people who serve us are in these positions and how well motivated they are, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. That these people are so easy to get caricatures of, and they're so easy to sort of to say negative things about them from the outside, particularly regardless of what your partisan affiliation is. If you're a Democrat, you say nasty things about Republicans and vice versa. But the experience of actually sitting in the room with them and coming to understand their goals and their aspirations and their successes and failures is actually quite illuminating. But there are comparisons. One of the things that I've come to conclude is that there is a different organizational culture in every White House, that there are certain virtues that differ across administrations. And a simple illustration of this would have been in, say, the George H.W. Bush administration. There was a sort of there was a reverence for hierarchy, and there was a sort of commitment to loyalty there. And then you come to the Clinton administration. It's a very flat structure, open organizational structure, tending towards chaos even. And the loyalty factor, it may have existed, but it would have been buried beneath the number of other virtues, one of which was just competence and brain power. That the best way to get recognized in the Clinton White House was to be the most brilliant person on a particular issue area, like Larry Summers, who went on to be president of Harvard. I hate to say that to a Yale-oriented station, but so that and then you come to the George W. Bush administration, and the virtues there are again sort of very process hierarchies oriented, order as much as anything, order decision making, and so I think that's where you see differences in these administrations. It's not in their commitment to the greater good. All of them are committed to that. It's not even in their fundamental competency, because these people don't rise to these positions without having an enormous amount on the ball. But there are certain virtues and maybe some vices that they are more ready to accept from one administration to the next. And I probably ought to stop there because I'm not sure.
That was a great answer. Boy, really fascinating. And it has always fascinated me, too, that the George W. Bush administration, for instance, had a very structured, disciplined, on-time orientation, but it doesn't necessarily mean the results were better than the chaos and never on time in the Clinton administration.
That's exactly right. And it's one of the questions we often ask is about paperwork. I mean, because there was, for example, with the invasion of Iraq, there was never a formal presidential decision memo created to say yes, we were going to go in. That's an interesting absence in an administration where there was so much focus on order and process and hierarchies and timeliness. I don't know what it represents. We're still at work on that administration. But these are questions that, even if you've done 1,000 hours of interviews with people, sometimes there are still unanswered questions. They're and maybe unanswerable.
Well, we've created our own oral history today. Fascinating interview with Russell Riley inside the Clinton White House and oral history. Thanks again for giving us the full hour coming on overtime. Thank you, Russell.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you.